On behalf of the McCarthy Center, our co-sponsors, the St. John's Senate, Cultural Affairs Board, and the International Intercultural Student Services, I'd like to welcome you to a special Politics and a Pint focused on the CSBSJU community and refugees. So I will now turn it over to Professor John Friend, political science professor here at St. John's St. Ben's, and he will get us underway.
Hey, how's everyone doing? Hopefully doing well tonight on this snowy Thursday. I want to thank everyone for coming out and supporting the McCarthy Center. When the McCarthy Center approached me to moderate this evening, I jumped at the chance. I think we need to have more discussion on refugees, on the current debates unfolding mostly in Europe, but I think for most of us, we're a bit isolated from this debate. We're not really aware of what's going on, the depth of refugees and the problems that they experience. So kind of prior to coming here tonight, I went online and I looked at some statistics that are put out by the UN Refugee Agency to really get a full grasp of the type of problem we're dealing with here, right? So again, according to their statistics, by the end of 2014, we've seen 59.5 million individuals forcibly displaced for a variety of reasons, ranging from persecution, conflict, various forms of violence, and of course human rights violations. It's a staggering number, right? Nearly 60 million people displaced as of 2014. Recently, and this is kind of on most of our attention, right, is what's going on in Europe. And we've seen an exceptionally high number of refugees entering Europe and the debate around what we should do, right? Some countries want to close their doors, other countries want to open their doors. Kind of shrouded around this debate is a lot of uncertainty, a lot of fear-based policy mongering, and a lot of concern of what the future holds. So I'm hoping, tonight we can talk a little bit more about this, open the black box of this refugee issue, really explore what the panelists have first-hand experience and can share with us. And hopefully this kind of kickstarts a larger discussion that won't just end today. So kind of citing Secretary General of the United Nations, Ban Ki-moon, he refers to this current plight of refugees as a human tragedy that requires a determined collective political response. I hope that response begins today, and I hope our panelists can enlighten us a little bit from their experiences on what this looks like on the ground. So let me introduce you to our panelists, because they're really the stars tonight. The first, and in the middle, is Sarah Clark, a biochemistry major and a music minor. She studied abroad last fall in Greece, and while in Greece, volunteered to help refugees on the island of Lesbos. While there, she worked with disaster medics and was stationed, I believe, in the north part of the island near Turkey. Okay. Like Sarah, Thomas O'Toole also was working in Greece, studying abroad, and working as an EMT, I believe, yes, and working with refugees from Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. And then finally, and of course not least, is Abdulaziz from who's, I don't have much information on you, but I have you a biochemistry major, and you're going to share with us your experience here tonight. So I'm going to hand it over to them. Thank you.
All right. Like I was wondering if this was working on that. But first I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Abdulaziz. I'm a second year at St. John's. And also my major is biochemistry. A little bit about me right now is I work at St. Cloud Hospital at the emergency room as a patient care extender. And I also kind of volunteer with the community organization in St. Cloud with the name Central Minnesota Community Empowerment. We work with the refugees and the minority groups around St. Cloud, kind of a little bit more entitled to empowerment. And so, first of all, a little bit about me is my parents. My mom is from Somalia, and my dad is Ethiopia. He's Ethiopian. And people kind of wonder how they met. But first, my dad was a refugee. He migrated to Somalia. He was a political refugee. And he was in Somalia, the capital city, where he met my mom. and unfortunately there was a civil war that happened in Somalia from 1991 after the Somalis ousted the the regime that was controlling that country. But ever since it was stateless since 2007. Now there was an interim government that was established in Kenya at 2006. Now they're kind of working and getting their feet back and having some sort of a state. But ever since, so when the civil war happened in 1991, my parents kind of stayed in Somalia, Mogadishu, the capital city. They did not leave. They stayed there for a while since 2006, when the Islamic court kind of overtook the whole place, and then my parents migrated and they kind of fled. That's the correct term for refugees. They fled to Kenya, and I was 9 years old. So my experience as a refugee, I was very young, and as a child, since the age 9, I have not went to any school. All I learned was the Islamic studies at home, which my dad was an Islamic scholar. In the refugee camps, I went to school. I started going to 3rd grade, and that's the first time I started learning English. The first English word I learned was "How are you?" It was the most complex word. It took me a week to memorize that. So my first education, or you can say Western education I received, was 2008 in the refugee camp. It's in Hagadera, one of the largest refugee camps. And the thing about refugees is, it was the largest refugee camp when I was there. So now I don't know if there is another refugee camp, because there are problems happening around our world, and most of the victims are civilians. In the case of what's happening in Syria, a lot of people are fleeing. So I grew up in the largest refugee camp in Kenya, and that's where I received my education. I just wanted to speak a little bit about my aspiration as a kid. Despite being in a refugee camp, we were not allowed to leave the refugees, so that was my own experience. I was taking science classes, and we did not have enough equipment for our labs, and so everything was just from the book. We never had even labs to practice or kind of understand the concepts we were learning. But my aspirations were very big. I was dreaming to be the United Nations Secretary, and it was kind of inspired. I was kind of inspired by the children I kind of grew up with. I wanted to change things around for all the refugees. And now as a kind of grown up 20-year-old college student, when I look back, I cannot stop thinking about the kids, or kind of think about my experience as a refugee. And now when you hear the debates about refugees, people are just talking about the host country. People are kind of busy talking about money. Let's say if there are millions of dollars are kind of fundraised for the refugees, little percent of that money will literally reach the refugees. Think about the tax the government will receive. What about the workers? So the monies that the Western countries send to the refugees hardly ever reach those kids. And in my schools, they used to distribute food. I used to remember they used to have little caps for the food. They used to do some out meals. And when things are really good, you get to get 2 cups. And that's the best week for you, like the best week you had. Like literally, you leave home without eating anything to go to school. And when you come back home, some families, mine sometimes we used to have lunch, but some children didn't have lunch. So the only meal that was cooked for their family would be just one meal. So the best meal that they could get off is the meal that's being distributed at school. But when things are bad, they only, like literally there are some weeks in the school, or even a whole month, where the output that's distributed in the school is going to be just half a cup. So when things are bad and there's no cars that will reach the refugees. And this is a refugee camp in a very safe country, which is Kenya, a country that does not have any problems going on at the current time, any like civil unrest. But what about the refugees that are still in war-torn countries, where, like in Somalia, there are displaced refugees, like internally displaced refugees. In the case of Syria, we have the same thing. So I kind of grew up in that kind of scenario but the best thing that was valued for me, like especially with my mom, was education. And you could tell the message from the parent was, you are our hope. You will be the one who will turn things. That's like the same message we received going to school. And even when we have guests that comes to our school, we will get the same message, which is, you guys are our hope. We hope you guys will turn around. And so I stayed in the refugee camps till the age 11, 12. And then my little sister was sick. She had a heart defect, and so we got a security and also / health resettlement opportunity to the United States of America. I came to the state in 2010. San Antonio, Texas was my first place. I stayed there for 6 months. Anybody from Texas? I love it. But at the same time, the challenges do not stop there. When we came to the States, my mom was the only parent at the time, and she could not speak English, and I was 13, and I had 2 older brothers, but the rest of my siblings, I have 9 siblings, and they were young. So my mom decided to move to Minnesota so that she could get close to her family, and in our culture can have support from a larger support from the rest of the community that lived in Minnesota. I came to the St. Cloud, and I enrolled in Tech High School as a sophomore. I went there till senior, where I had the opportunity to come to CSBSJU. This is my 2nd year at St. John's. I could see myself growing up. I came here as an 18-year-old boy, and that was my first time living by myself without my parents. So I had to figure out a lot of things by myself, get my first car, pass my classes, of course. Yeah, but I'm glad that you guys all came, and I will have the rest of the time to kind of share with you guys their stories. Thank you.
Hi. So I'm Thomas O'Toole. I'm a junior biochemistry major. We're all biochemistry majors. Sarah and I are going to probably go back and forth a little bit telling our story since it's very similar. So last semester, Sarah and I both had the opportunity to study abroad on the Roman Greco program, and that made us in Athens for the second half of the semester. And when we were there, one of our colleagues, Katie Schmitz, she had talked to an NGO or a non-governmental organization, Disaster Medics, and that she helped to schedule a medical assisting volunteership at an island off the coast of Turkey. And so we both, basically how it happened was Katie said, do you guys want to go to this island Lesbos and assist with refugees? And we're like, yes, of course. And then we're like, when is it? And she's like, tomorrow. And we're like, okay. So then about 11 o'clock that night, we booked a flight, and we left about 5 hours later on the flight off to Lesbos. And so then we went there, and then we arrived on the island and immediately got picked up at the airport and were driven directly to the beaches. And so that's actually where we did most of our medical assistance, was directly on the beaches where the rafts were coming in from the coast of Turkey, which was right across the water from us. You can actually see the coast of Turkey. And so we're on the northern shore. And so Sarah will talk a little bit about the process of refugees coming onto the beaches.
Alright, so I'm Sarah. Like Thomas said, I was on the Roman Greco study abroad. And I'll just give a little background on the island of Lesbos, so you guys can get a little context. It's an island very close to Turkey. The northern shore where we were working is about 6 to 8 miles from the coast of Turkey, and so that is where many of the refugees come across in boats that I don't even know if they can really be considered boats. But so we spend some of our time on the beaches, and our job as being part of the disaster medics group was to ensure the safety and good health of the people coming over. And so we mostly just try to survey the scene as boats would come in and make sure there were no critical medical cases. Most of the issues that we had were related to hypothermia and shock. The water, although it was still like 50s and 60s, it's pretty cold, and so that was a major issue. And So I'll give a little kind of story about what happens when the refugees come over. So they come from all over the Middle East. I think most of them were Syrians that we worked with. And so they, coming from the Turkey side, they pay smugglers fees from about $1,500 US to about up to like $4,000 US to get on these rubber rafts, essentially. The max capacity is considered about 10 to 15 people, but they would fit about 50 people on these rafts. They would get about a 15 horsepower motor and just enough gas to make it to the Greek shore. The first boat we saw actually got stranded about 100 yards out from shore because they ran out of gas, and that wasn't good weather and calm waters. So they had issues quite often with just making it to the island, and I think this year so far, I think I saw about 400 people have died just trying to get from Turkey to Lesbos. So the boats that they were on, most of these people had never seen such a large body of water, and they were instructed to drive the boats. They were kind of just pointed in the direction of the shore, and whatever happened to them is kind of what happened. By the time they got to the shore, the journey sometimes lasted upwards of like 6 to 8 hours, but sometimes could be shorter than that, maybe 2 or 3. And they would come to the shore depending on which direction they started. Certain areas were better for landing than others, and volunteers were really trying to funnel people into the good areas to land, but some areas are quite dangerous. We didn't really help people get off the boats because there was so much commotion that a lot of times with medical issues, it was the quieter people that you had to watch out for that might be struggling the most. And once they got off the boats, they had to walk miles often to get to the next stop. And this is kind of where Thomas will talk about the journey once they got to the island.
So, as Sarah said, the refugees would arrive on the beaches there and be assisted by personnel that were all volunteer. There was no governmental entities that were on the beaches there. And so from that point, there would be families, and families usually, if they were more than 3 or 4, would actually wait there, and then they'd be taken by a van or some kind of transportation to a camp, because it was, it could be up to 3 miles of a walk from the beach, and that's not counting the fact that they, just made an 8-hour, sometimes, trip across the ocean. And then before that, they had, a lot of them actually physically walked from wherever country they originated in, all the way up to Turkey and then across on the boat. And so basically the next part was that they would go on walking to the next camp, which is stage 1 camp. And so the stage 1 camps was the locations where they give them a bit of food, not a ton, water, change of clothes, all donated clothes, and usually then they would go on to the stage 2 camp. So they'd walk again 3 to 5 miles to the stage 2 camps on the island of Lesbos. And there was 2 stage 2 camps and 2 stage 1 camps, right? And once they were at the stage 2 camp was more of like a way station. So this was a point that they could gather and stop and get more food and kind of regroup to a degree before they were taken by bus about a 10 to 15 mile trip to a stage 3 camp. And so a stage 3 camp, I actually was separated from my group of volunteers and went to a stage 3 camp to work for a day. And these are the camps that are the final place on the island before they're actually taken to Athens from this location. And so the stage 1 and stage 2 camps are in random areas, and they're formed by tents. They might have a makeshift fence around them, and the stage 3 camp was actually, I think there's only one on the island there. The stage 3 camp was actually at a prison, a Greek prison. So this is the first point that they'll actually meet Greek authority or even European authority in general. And so at this point, they will go and they are bused there to get off the bus, and they'll walk into this camp. And the first thing you see is just absolute destruction. The entire place is just a pit of garbage. of destroyed tents and destroyed sleeping bags, bottles, and garbage everywhere. The conditions are horrendous, and there's a medical tent at the bottom of this kind of sloping area. And that's where I worked, and the prison lays right up above. And so we were there, and so when the new refugees would come in, there's medical assistance at each stage, but then by the time they got here, they were needing care. They might have a cough, they have a sore throat, they have pain someplace, and so we help them out in any way we can. And a lot of that was children getting sick from cold, from all the different factors that were from their trip. And then at that stage, they would stay some time, depending on how long their paperwork took to process through the Greek authorities. They would have to stay there for a long time. And this camp was mostly non-Syrians, right? And so they were processed differently because Syrians have a different status at that time, and now as well. But so they would line up along the fences and they have to go in, and then if they didn't have their documentation on them, then that was when a worse process started for them. They would be there for an even longer time. And so they then go to this little tent where there's volunteers as well, and then they'd be passed whatever kind of supplies that they had. If they had a family, they're more likely to get a tent. They might not get a tent. So there's a lot of makeshift shelters that were built out of just string and stuff that's tied it together with tarps over the top or anything, so that they would have some kind of shelter for the night, because it did get very cold and very windy. And so when we were there, we didn't do a ton of super intense medical care, but it was a lot more of reaffirming that these people were okay to them, because they come up to us, and then we couldn't speak Arabic or Urdu or anything like that, so they would come up. No one spoke each other's language, and then we do whatever we could to assist them at that time. So that's kind of the stage 3, and then that's when they took to Athens, and then on from there. But that was the end of their time on the island that we worked at.
I guess I'll take this opportunity from the audience, or? Okay.
I was wondering what organizations were there to assist these refugees. Was like a Red Cross there? Did the Catholic Charities, was that there? Or what organizations were there?
So at the location that we were at, it was all non-governmental organizations, and so the main ones that stood out were our organization, and I'm more familiar with the medical ones. There was Samaritan's Purse was ones that from students from St. Ben's also volunteered at when we were there, and then another prominent group was the Adventists Medical Aid group, and they had very nice facilities, and they had a lot of resources for medications and equipment that we would stop by a lot, and they'd give you whatever you needed, and then if we had extra things, and then we'd give it to them that they needed, and they set up a more immediate care and more traumatic care center so that they could treat things like that. But other organizations, there's a lot of smaller organizations, and then independent like freelance doctors and nurses that would come. There was Israeli Aid organization that was there. That was formed by a group of Israeli doctors, and they were extremely nice. We worked with them very closely, our organization did. And just a fun, meaningful point to make about that as well is that there was also Palestinian doctors there, and they worked with the Israeli doctors very closely. So that was really nice to see.
Along with, you kind of talked about the medical organizations, but there were environmental aid, which I hadn't really thought about until we got there, and the beaches are absolutely covered in life jackets and boats. And so by the time we got there, I think a few months prior they didn't have a presence there, but by the time we were there were environmental aid that were working to clean up the island. And then also the Spanish lifeguard had a pretty big presence. They patrolled the waters, and I don't really know the role of the Greek Coast Guard or the Turkish Coast Guard, but the Spanish lifeguard really came through and seemed like things were a lot safer while they were there.
Hello, thanks everyone for being on the panel. I kind of have a very unique interest, especially in resettlement here, but I also noticed, even if we were talking about your experience on the island, you kept saying it would take a long time. So what I'm wondering is if you could explain, like, do you have any idea how long a long time is? And then Abdi, I know resettlement here is a very long process. And so I'm wondering, would you say that you know, like everyone in your family, you mentioned you have a lot of siblings. So what is that like? Do you all feel, I don't know what the right word is there, but would you say that process, how long would you say that took? And moving from Texas to here, what was, you know, give us some sense of when you are all saying it takes a long time. You know, do we have any sense of how long? And especially Abdi, what were some of the factors that play into learning English and adjusting here for your family? What is that like? But thank you all for being here.
Okay, this will be pretty quick because I really don't know much about how long it takes. We saw a very, very short period of their process, really just a tiny little snippet into their whole journey. But from what we saw, it's just a slow moving process. So for them to take 5 days even on the island, and that's only a tiny fraction, I can't imagine how long it takes to do the whole journey.
Just to clarify that as well, we talked to a journalist from Lebanon when we were there, and he had actually made the journey across with a family from Syria, all the way from Syria to Macedonia, and up to someplace else, Germany, I believe, yeah. And so he made this entire trip, and he said it took a total of 6 weeks. So that's a little bit of what he said.
Well, you asked me a couple questions, but how long usually, like for us in the refugee camp, I don't remember like when we first got to the refugee camp, I was a kid, but like when we were going through the resettlement process, we will have appointments. They like once we would meet with the immigration from the United Nations delegations, and sometimes we will meet with local IOM, like international IOM, if you're familiar with it. Like they will make us go through like a health process where they will do a thorough checkup of our health, and each day will be like you will spend the whole day going through this process. Like one aspect will be transportation, like you will wait for transportation for hours, and then when transportation gets you there, you have to wait, and it's like literally when they're also going, the people that interview us when they go for lunch, we have to sit there and wait, so it's like a whole day process. And for us, my siblings, especially when we were moving from San Antonio to St. Cloud, I was the oldest in my family that was traveling at that time because my brother the older one kind of traveled before us. But it was actually a very tiring process. That was my first time leading the family for me, and we were like 7 siblings at that time, and we didn't speak good English, so it was like literally what we did was, you know how when you have a big luggage, you process them and then the airplane will take care of it, but we did not know that, so we had to come inside to the plane, and then they had to like tell us to go back, and it's a big cultural difference, and when you don't know how things work, it gets really complicated. With English, I will say I was learning more like grammatical side at the refugee camps, and speaking wise, it was really difficult. Like I kind of I was like when I my first EL course in Texas, and my oral speaking was really poor, but my writing and other stuff was really good. But I would say it's more like language acquisition kind of plays in more like instruction. How much do you interact with other people, like the native of that language? And also age also is another factor where my older brother and my parents really don't speak that great of an English, but even my younger brother speaks better English than me, so age is a big factor. Thank you.
I was just wondering, you guys spoke about some amazing things that you were able to do while you were studying abroad and volunteering with the refugees. I was wondering if you had any idea what Bennies and Johnnies here that don't have the opportunity to go over there, the finances, or to go over there, what we can do here to kind of help out. Maybe if Zach, maybe you kind of have an opinion about that too, since you work in the community volunteering and empowerment and things like that. But yeah, I was just wondering, as far as us here, what can we do?
So that's a really good question, and that's something that I thought a lot about being here and not being able to directly help, and I know Sarah has too. And the biggest thing that I think people can do, you know, without financially and that kind of thing, is just letting, I don't know, trying to get out the fact that this isn't about politics, that this isn't about things like that. This isn't about the government. This is about people, and this is about humans, and this is about dignity, and this is about people that need to be respected, and this is about people's safety. And this isn't about making a political statement. This isn't about anything but respecting people. And I think that that's what I learned most of all from being there. And the more people that realize that these are just people, these are like our neighbors, that they just need help, and they need to be accepted. They need our assistance to make their own lives. Because these are parents that are sending their teenage children all the way across their own country, through multiple countries, to get to Europe. And so if they're going to send them to that, and then they send them to these camps that are horrible, imagine what it's like back where they came from. And so I think just using any method that people can to get out that, to just try to teach people that this isn't about politics, that this is about respecting other people and helping them and truly caring for humanity. I think that's the biggest thing that we can do. I know it doesn't sound like much, but I feel like that's, if that message really is truly believed by more people, I think that that'll do a lot to help the situation.
I've struggled with that a lot since coming back, not being able to have the helping hands-on and being there in person, but something that another volunteer said to me stood out a lot, and they said that their family didn't want them to go. And his question to them was, they say we can't save them all, but does that mean we shouldn't save any? And I think that's really stood out to me as a student. I don't really have funding or time to take off and go back to Lesbos to help out, but the little things that we can do here are really important. So if that means that you spark up a conversation with someone of refugee status and you ask them kind of their opinion on things and just try to get a better understanding of them as people, kind of like Thomas was saying, I think that can go a long way, and I think it will make them feel a lot more welcome here, which I think is something that we as students can really help do.
I would kind of agree with both of them at the same time. You know, this is not about politics. These are people, and there's always things that you can do to help. You know, like even financially, sometimes people might think that's out of reach, but if we all chip in $5, which is not a lot of money, there are well-respected organizations that you can donate to, which have online fundraising. That $5 or $2 will be of much help to those people. And other things that you can do is first try to understand, try to humanize. It's really, the word refugee can be lost in the world of politics. You know, sometimes there's a lot of politics that, you know, kind of bury this word behind. And like even when you go to media sometimes, people are kind of caught up talking about the people who are in conflict, like the players in the conflict, forgetting about the civilians, forgetting about people. So we can try to understand them, and like for me, like my memories from the refugee camps are, like there were organizations that would come over and just organize a dancing like day, like World Refugee Day. We would come around and start dancing. Those are things that will preoccupy our mind, and like here and there, sometimes you get a glimpse of hope where you don't even remember, where you don't like think you're in a refugee. So if you become forced in creating those moments, I would think that would be the best thing that you can do to help.
Can Professor Fenn please weigh in on the subject, and just, can you please tell your opinion on that same question?
Oh, okay. Of course.
You thought you might have some great ideas.
Oh, well, you were wrong. So this is kind of what we can do here. Yeah, I think, and not to just kind of say ditto to what they've said, but I think having conversations is a good first start. And speaking with people who've experienced refugee status firsthand, like Abdulrazak, and asking these individuals what should be done. Instead of thinking what we could do, we should ask what they need and then work from there. You know, maybe this is something you could share with us. If you could advise the future Thomases and the future Sarahs on what could be done to improve the status of refugees, what would you suggest, right? I think these are the kind of conversations we should have. Working with the communities to empower them. And there's a lot of issues here in St. Cloud. You don't have to go all the way to Lesbos to make a difference, right? So start local, think global, right? So maybe you could elaborate a little bit on what you would advise the future NGO workers or those that are interested in this issue, you know, working with refugees, what would be some lessons learned from your experiences?
Well, as he said, you know, sometimes you have to think locally. That's the best, one of the best slogans that we have at this school. For me, when I first came here, you know, there are a lot of things that I did not know about my new country, you know, my new place that I was calling my new country. I didn't even know how to use a library card. So we have a new refugees that will come over. So if you come and volunteer with them, literally take them one day and show them how to use the buses or take them to a library. Or if you cannot afford that, just have a lunch with them, have a conversation with them. Those are very small things that you can do. Sometimes it's really easy to kind of give up to the notion of us versus them, the refugees, and where you isolate them. You might not think you're isolating them, but by not, if you just, they don't, sometimes they might not look like you. So if you just go and walk past them, not acknowledging, not having conversation, those are very minor things that I think anybody can do. You know, anybody can do that. And also there are a lot of organizations that help out in different ways, educationally, with transportation, with a lot of things. So facilitating that, and I would say a lot of you guys can do peace studies or some sort of major that help out refugees. Making sure that these people sometimes might not speak the language, making sure that they're receiving everything that they need, making sure that their well-being is intact, that they're having support in the community. That will be something vital that you can help out all. Yeah.
Yes, if I could add to that, I think we need to keep in mind that resettlement is a process, right? It's not over when they make it to the St. Cloud or make it to Macedonia or wherever they end up, right? They need to transition, and there needs to be resources in place to help with that transition. So for those of you that are interested in this type of issue, that would be something to look towards, right? How can we help those that have recently arrived transition better? Because it's hard, right? Something as simple as, how do I get a library card? We take for granted that they don't, right? So I think going to the communities and asking them what they need may be a lot different than what you think they need, right? Maybe they just want that library card first, and then from there we can figure it out, kind of thing. So, good.
You mentioned that hardly any of the aid actually gets to refugees. And I'm wondering, I get appeals all the time, International Rescue Committee, the UN High Commission on Refugees, Catholic Relief Services, it just goes on and on and on, UNICEF. Are there any organizations that you recommend that really the bulk of the money actually gets to people? Where should I be channeling my funds?
We have a collection here.
Speaking from my perspective, I don't know about those organizations that you listed, but a lot of the medical organizations that we work alongside, I know the one that I work with, any money that they got was actually sent directly to the medics that were on the island. So it paid for the house that we stayed in, so that they could get people there to help, and then it paid for the equipment that we used. And most of the equipment that we used was also donated because we didn't have a lot of funding there. But I know that that was a good organization that did use all of the money to directly help the refugees, and there was no administrative costs there because it was all a volunteer organization. But I'm not sure about the others.
Yes, the question that you asked me, sometimes, especially the refugee camp I was in, the main role players that helped a lot were the UNHCR and WFP. WFP was working on distributing food and everything like that. But sadly, one of the sad things about it is sometimes the host nation or the host country that's hosting the refugees, they have a lot of loopholes. You know, the first when the food arrives at the airport, like sometimes, like literally what happens at the refugee camp that I worked was refugees were not eligible to work. So sometimes the host country will force the agencies to hire some locals, and then they will have to pay them double for working, while the refugee workers will not receive a lot of money, like not enough to support their families. So those are like legit challenges. I'm not an expert in refugees, so I won't be able to give you the best answer I could. But one thing I would definitely advocate is for refugees to be able to work, to be able to earn their money while in the refugees. Because sometimes that there is a dignity to working, to earning your own food or whatever you do. Sometimes it's really, I don't know, my mom did not feel good about just receiving food from the WFP. There was a lot of this morality that involved, you know, like all my talk with my man I had was, there was a big dismoral in being a refugee. Like that started with a lot of problems. And sometimes literally there's nothing that you can do. And in the refugee camp, my mom worked as a midwife, so that kind of helped out a little bit. But that's something that I would advocate for, like and let the refugees be able to kind of have some sort of work, something to do. Thank you.
My question is for Abby. How hard was it to become integrated into like the local community? Do you feel like you're a part of it, or do you still feel like it was a different?
Well, especially at Bennies and Johnnies, it was kind of hard my first semester. I didn't know a lot of people, and all the interaction I had was purely academic, so I would interact with people in the classroom, but outside the classroom, I would kind of interact back to my room. But as you know, like this is college, so things kind of change up as you become upperclassmen. So this year I'm a sophomore. I have tons of friends that I can have coffee with, that I can kind of chill with. But definitely it was really hard my first semester. I didn't know anybody, so.
I have a question for Professor Friend. Could you please comment on like current refugee crisis in Europe? Because we've been hearing a lot and heard some stories. So it's like, what is the solution international relations academia would suggest? And as an economics major, I'm interested in how it's gonna work out financially, financial markets wise, and just costs wise. So thank you.
To be honest, that's quite a difficult set of questions to answer. And I'm not, unfortunately, no means an expert on the refugee crisis in Europe. I know what I read, and I think many of you are familiar more with this issue as it's unfolding in Europe. The fact that some European countries have accepted or are willing to accept. Germany was an example of that. Now that tone is starting to change to some degree, but they were generally open. Others, Eastern European countries, not so much, right? There was a lot of desire to keep out refugees. So there's this debate, right? Are they, and it's fear-based to some degree. It's exaggerated. It's political, as the panelists have pointed out, and it's as a result removed the human element from it, right? We were associating refugees with the bigger actors, as Audrey pointed out, in the region, with ISIS, with other forms of terrorism and aggression. And that's not the case, right? So this is kind of shaping the debates. The fear about assimilating, right, and funding, who's going to pay for it, right? This is something that's always being argued. You know, the logistics of who pays for it, I can't really offer much insight, unfortunately. But this, you know, some countries see this as an advantage, right? Others don't. So I kind of tiptoed around your question, but.
I wanted to add a little bit to that. Sometimes some people are they take out the human element out of it. Like in the case of Somalia, in 1991, after the civil war, there was that armed imperial. So they were like literally, legally, no arms could go into Somalia. But the equation is not locally about the actors are also international actors where people politically they may not need stability in that country, and they will just keep arming one side of the equation, and another international community will side with the other side, where this will be literally standoff, where nobody will think about the people. Not right now in the case of Syria, if you look at it, you have the regime supported by Russia, and you have the U.S. coalition supporting other moderate opposition. But like I was reading an article that said the debate in Syria is lacking Syrians, and the first thing that people will need is making the country stable. I will honestly tell you this: like nobody wants to leave their country. Everybody, still up to today. My mom always says, "I want to go back to my country." So the yearning of going back to your mother country, the yearning of being in your country where you can champion for change. Those refugees have this similar yearning, but unluckily, there's a lot of international players that might not need stability in those specific regions, and they will work hard to keep it that way.
All right, we have time for one more question.
Hi, so I know we talked a lot about like the refugee crisis in Europe and those similar areas, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit, maybe on Professor Friend, about the refugees in Asia, like in Myanmar, the political refugees there.
Okay. Sure. What exactly would you like to, I mean, in terms of?
Well, like, just if you could explain maybe a little bit about their plight too, since we talked about like the refugees.
Right, so I think their experience is similar yet unique, right? From what I understand, and this could probably be said for a lot of the refugees from Syria, from the Maghreb, from Northern Africa, because it's not just Syrians, right, that are fleeing, although 50% of their population is kind of displaced, right, according to the UN refugee stats. So what we see, right, what we see in Asia with displaced people, either internally displaced or kind of refugees, is they're treated poorly, right? They find themselves in another country, and there's xenophobic policies kind of towards them, and they're kind of marginalized, and they're and this goes for any refugee susceptible to human trafficking, exploitation, right? And because they're not of that country, because they're refugees, it's easier for policymakers and the population at large to kind of ignore it, right? Say, well, that's not our people, right? And to let these people, in some sense, just get stuck on the border, where they're just kind of camped on the border and not receiving any attention or assistance, right? In fact, some have said it's worse to be internally displaced than to be a refugee, because at least the host country may provide some service, but if you're internally displaced and you are being persecuted by that government, there's no one there to help you. So in some sense, that's far worse. And we are seeing that in some parts of Asia. So I'm talking very broadly, I know, but that's kind of what I see.
All right, well, I'd like to have everyone put their hands together for a great panel. Just a heads up that our next Politics and Pint will be the 25th of February, back to our 5 p.m. start time. I know tonight we went 6:30, but 5 p.m. on the 25th of February, that's a Thursday, 2 weeks from today. And we'll have Representative Drew Christensen from the Savage Burnsville area here to talk about the Minnesota legislative process. Again, thank you all for coming. Edwin, got something?
If anyone's really interested, there's a great organization on campus called Hands Across the World, which actually volunteers in St. Cloud and teaches recent refugees in that area. You can also email the McCarthy Center if you want to get in contact with them. Hands Across the World. Thank you.